What if I told you that one of Jesus' most famous parables is often preached inappropriately? What if I told you that this isn't just a story about praying more, trying harder, or repeating your requests until heaven finally answers? What if this video were presented as a scene in a courtroom? A widow steps forward. The judge holds a position of authority. The opponent is at the back. The case is ongoing. The verdict was delayed. Jesus turns all of this into a question of whether faith will remain firm until the return of the Son of Man. This changes everything, because once Luke 18 is analyzed in this way, the parable ceases to be tender, sentimental, and predictable. The situation becomes tense. It becomes urgent. It becomes painfully relevant, because suddenly, it wasn't just one woman who kept asking questions. This is what God's people do when justice is delayed, when evil seems to be protected, when corrupt systems don't care, and when you feel that your cause is still waiting to be heard. Most people are completely unaware of this fact. They hear the phrase, "the persevering widow," and immediately reduce the text to a lesson about not giving up in prayer. And, to be fair, this is part of the message. Jesus begins the story by saying that his disciples should always pray and never lose hope. And this is true. But that's not all that's true. Because Jesus could have taught this lesson in 100 different ways. He could have hired a farmer who was waiting for the rain. He could have sought help from a fellow traveler looking for assistance. He could have asked a child to ask his father. Instead, he chooses legal images. He gives us a judge. He gives us a discount. It introduces us to a widow who demands justice. This means that if we turn this passage into a general message of encouragement, we lose the power of what Jesus is really doing. It doesn't just teach perseverance. It teaches us to persevere in the face of injustice. He teaches how to pray in case of delay. It teaches faith to people who feel insignificant in a world governed by indifferent powers. If that is truly what this passage is about, then Luke 18 is not just a pleasant reflection to meditate on. It is a survival text. It is a text for weary believers. It is a text for believers who are waiting. It is a text for believers who still believe in God's justice, but who are trying to understand why justice is delayed. That's why we should take our time and read this passage carefully. Luke 18 begins like this. Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not despair. This first sentence is important because Luke gives us the explicit purpose of the parable from the beginning. Jesus wants his disciples to pray. Jesus wants his disciples not to lose hope. So yes, prayer is essential. But Jesus places this lesson directly in a very specific scene. It says that in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. This description is extremely harsh. Jesus did not simply say that the judge was busy. He is not saying that the judge is imperfect. He is not saying that the judge is under pressure. He says that this man neither fears God nor cares what people think. In other words, this judge lacks responsibility and empathy. He has no respect for heaven and feels no shame in front of society. He's exactly the kind of person you'd fear if your future depended on his decision. Then Jesus introduces the widow to him. You will immediately notice the imbalance in the scene. This is not the entry of two equal parties into a neutral system. This represents, on the one hand, a strength, and on the other hand, a weakness. This is where the power lies, and where the weakness lies. This is a woman with no influence who finds herself facing a man who has plenty of reasons to ignore her. Then she speaks. She says, "Grant me justice against my adversary." This phrase is the key to the whole proverb. No help me. No park, not make my life easier. It's not give me peace, justice. This means that it is not just a personal desire. This is an error that must be corrected. This relates to injuries, opposition, conflict, and legal redress. She has a discount. That word is important. There are those who oppose it. There are those who oppose it. Someone has mistreated, threatened, exploited, or harmed her cause in some way. And now he doesn't ask for compassion. She demands justice. For this reason, this proverb should be listened to with a legalistic tone. There is a judge. There is a plaintiff. There's a discount. There is a recurring cry for justice. There is a delay in the response. This is a courtroom. Once the story is heard in this way, the prayer itself begins to be perceived differently. Prayer is no longer just a private spirituality. Prayer becomes a call. The sentence becomes a means of presenting the problem. The prayer becomes a denunciation of injustice before the judge of all the earth, and a refusal to allow evil to dictate the final verdict. For a time, the judge rejected it. This statement is more important than many readers realize. He refused for a while. This means that the widow lives in the void between reality and the outcome. She knows she has a case. She knows that an injustice has been committed. She knows that the judge has the authority. However, nothing happens. This is the agony of delayed justice. Many people accept a harsh answer more readily than a silent delay. A firm no, at least, puts an end to the uncertainty. But the delay keeps the wound open. The delay leaves the issue open. The delay forces you to wake up tomorrow and face the same unresolved burden again. That is why this proverb reaches the very depths of a person's heart. Because many believers know exactly what that feeling is. You are praying. I am waiting. Nothing moves. She asks again. The situation remains the same. At first you feel hopeful. Then you're confused, so you're tired. And then, if the silence lasts long enough, the real temptation begins to change. The real temptation is not always absolute disbelief. The real temptation is often an emotional surrender. Stop waiting. Stop leaning forward. You stop sending the request with the same confidence. You may still believe in God in theory, but your prayers are losing strength because your hope has weakened. That is why Luke says that Jesus told this story so that his disciples would pray and not lose hope. Jesus knows perfectly well what delay does to the human soul. He knows that when people can't find anyone, they get tired of it. He knows that a long wait can make faith seem absurd. He knows that injustice can make prayer seem fragile. And that is precisely why he tells this story the way he does. He wants his disciples to see themselves reflected in this widow, not in their gender, nor in every detail of their social status, but in their weakness, their dependence, and their recurring appeal. The widow has no apparent authority. This is one of the most important details of the entire proverb. It has no army. She has no wealth. She has no social status. She doesn't have a degree. She has no apparent influence. In the ancient world, widowhood often meant being exposed to the elements. A widow may simultaneously face economic insecurity, social vulnerability, and legal precarity. In biblical tradition, widows are repeatedly categorized as vulnerable groups whose cause God specifically defends. Bible portal, Cielo, South Africa. Therefore, Jesus did not choose just anyone, but one of the most famous social figures in the Bible. This is not a coincidence. The widow represents the type of person the regime seeks to silence. She represents the type of person who can be ignored with few or no social consequences. She represents the type of person who is on his side but almost nothing more. However, they keep coming. This is the most shocking moment in history. The judge has authority, but the widow has patience. The judge has status, but the widow has determination. The judge has the power, but the widow has the moral clarity. You can postpone it. She can come back. According to the logic of the proverb, their refusal to disappear becomes the turning point. For this reason, this is much more than a simple repetition lesson. This is a revelation of what faith means when all that remains is to attain it. When power fades, when influence fades, when emotional energy fades, and when no earthly power seems willing to help, what remains? They will keep coming. She is continuing with the case. She continues to appear before those who have the right to judge. This is what the widow does. This is what Jesus teaches his disciples to do. Not because God doubts in the same way a judge does, but because the act of continuing to turn to God in the face of delay is itself an expression of faith. Then Jesus allows us to hear the voice of the inner judge. He actually says, "Although I do not fear God, and I do not care what people think, I will make sure that this widow gets justice because I keep bothering her, so that she does not come to attack me." This statement is almost shocking in its frankness. A judge doesn't change simply because he becomes good. It changed because perseverance became costly. He is not awakening morally. calculate in a practical way. He is not moved by compassion. He is affected by the disturbance. He wants peace. He wants to rest. He wants to get away from the widow. Jesus wants us to feel how terrible that is. This judge is not a complicated anti-hero. He is corrupt. He says it in his own words. He fears neither God nor men. He is indifferent to moral obligation. He is indifferent to human dignity. Even when he finally acts, he does not do so for noble reasons. He is acting this way because the widow's insistence has become a burden he no longer wishes to bear. This is important because one of the biggest mistakes people make with this passage is assuming that it is comparing God to an unjust judge in a directly moral way. This is not what Jesus does. He is not saying that God is like a reluctant bureaucrat who can be worn out with repeated prayers. He is not saying that prayer is the method believers use to annoy God and urge him to act. He's not saying that heaven works like a corrupt office where the person who shouts the loudest in the end gets the approval. No. The logic of the proverb goes from the smallest to the largest. If even an unjust judge ends up responding, how much more will a just God respond to his people? That is the power of Jesus' argument. The judge is the dark background that makes God's character shine through the contrast. The judge is acting out of selfishness. God acts motivated by a sense of justice. The judge is acting this way because he is upset. God acts because he is faithful. The judge is indifferent to the weak. Throughout the entire Bible, God identifies himself as the defender of the weak. It is necessary to pressure the judge to take action. God calls his people to pray to him day and night. These are not minor differences. This is the crux of the matter. Therefore, when Jesus says, "Listen to what the unjust judge says," he is not inviting us to confuse God with the judge. It invites us to listen to the logic. If perseverance can overcome even corruption, how much more will a just and living God hear the cries of his chosen ones? The principle of the more the merrier is everything here. Without that, the proverb becomes spiritually dangerous. In this way, the proverb becomes a source of deep comfort, because prayer at that moment is not a game. Prayer is trust. Constant supplication is not a burden to God. Continuous prayer is a refusal to allow delay to redefine God's attributes. This is a fundamental distinction. Many believers assume deep down that if God has not yet answered, then perhaps he is indifferent. He may be upset. Perhaps God denies them help for reasons they cannot understand. Perhaps their repeated prayers have become undesirable. Luke 18 eliminates all of that. God is not the moral equivalent of an unjust judge. God is what the unjust judge is not. That's why believers keep coming. Stop for a moment, because this is where many people misunderstand the entire passage. The word that is repeated in this story is justice. The widow demands justice. Jesus says that God will establish justice. He says this in the context of speaking about his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night. This means that the fundamental issue here is not the general will. It's not just about personal success. It is not about satisfying all personal desires. This is justice, absolution. Correct the error, repel evil, to defend those who are being crushed by forces superior to themselves. This is what gives this proverb its seriousness. The original language supports this legalistic approach. The widow's request and the summary of Jesus' words employ terms related to equity or the administration of justice, not merely vague help. Bible Hub website. This is important because this paragraph is often shortened to a general formula for a sentence that will be answered. Ask for enough prayers and God will eventually answer you. But Jesus is looking for something deeper than that. He trains his disciples to become people who cry out for God's justice in a world where injustice still exists. This includes personal suffering, but goes beyond mere personal well-being. It includes personal wounds, but extends to history itself. It is the cry that says, "Lord, do what is right." It is the cry that says, "O Lord, do justice to your name, do justice to your people, answer what is crooked, and do not allow evil to continue forever." That is why this passage has great power for persecuted believers. That's why it reaches people who are suffering. That is why she addresses the exhausted church. Because sometimes the most sincere prayers that remain in a wounded heart are simple and uncomplicated. It's simple. Sir, look at this. O Lord, answer this question. Lord, judge this matter. Lord, do not let the darkness continue to triumph. Jesus did not rebuke that prayer. He confirms it. He places that lament at the heart of the proverb. This means that biblical prayer is not an escape from reality. Biblical prayer is resistance. It is a resistance to despair. He is resistant to pessimism. It is a resistance to the lie that injustice is normal and permanent. It is a resistance to the idea that evil controls the future. And if that seems like too much, that's how it should be. Because Jesus is not imparting a superficial lesson here. He teaches his disciples how to live in the tension between the world as it is and the world as God promised it would be. Then, when the allegorical story seems dense enough, Jesus adds the phrase that changes everything. He concludes by saying, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" This question places the entire passage within an eschatological framework. In other words, it is not limited to daily prayers at ordinary times. It's about having patience during a time of waiting. It refers to the period of time between the first coming of Christ and his return. It's about how God's people are supposed to look while they await the final resolution of everything. That's why the end of the proverb is extremely important. Jesus did not simply say, "God will answer." He says, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith?" This means that the real question is not simply whether justice will be done or not. Jesus affirms, in effect, that God will do justice to his chosen people. The real question is whether faith will withstand this delay. This is extremely relevant, because the greatest danger in times of waiting is not always open rebellion. The greatest danger is usually internal corrosion. Faith weakens, hope fades away, the prayer ceases, not because the believer suddenly rejects God, but because the long wait has gradually weakened their expectations. Jesus clearly sees that danger. He knows that the church can maintain its language even if it loses its urgency. He knows that people can still talk about God without shouting at him. He knows that believers can remain religious in appearance while becoming submissive on the inside. Therefore, the question is posed in a way that directly appeals to the conscience. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? In this passage, faith appears in a very specific way. Faith looks like a widow who keeps showing up. Faith seems to consist of returning the same unresolved burden to God over and over again. Faith is manifested in the refusal to give in to silence. Faith is like patience that never runs out. Faith feels like screaming day and night because you still believe that justice belongs only to God. For this reason, this example is not actually about technology. It's about identity. It deals with the kind of people Jesus' disciples are supposed to become. The intention is not for them to become sarcastic. The intention is not for them to become negative. They are not meant to become people who silently accept darkness as a permanent state. They are supposed to become people who keep pleading with the fair judge. This effect is reinforced when Luke 18 is considered in its context. Many commentators point out that the issue of faith and the Son of Man links this parable to Jesus' teaching in Luke 17 about the days of the Son of Man and the long wait for his return, Besephasis. So this is not random. Jesus prepares his disciples for the long intermediate stage, the midpoint between promise and execution, the midpoint between resurrection and return. The midpoint is where the kingdom has settled, but the world remains shattered. In the center is where God spoke, but evil continues to make noise. Christ reigns in the middle ground, but there are still many things to resolve. How do believers survive this transition phase? They are praying. They haven't lost hope. They demand justice. They leave the matter open before God. This brings us to one of the most difficult lines in the entire passage. Jesus says that God will do justice to his chosen people, and he says that he will do it quickly. This raises the obvious question. If God acts swiftly, why does he seem so slow? Why do God's people cry out day and night? Why do some prayers seem to take months, years, or even decades to be answered? Why would Jesus talk about perseverance if the answer is quick? This tension is not a problem that needs to be eliminated from the clip. It is part of the text. Jesus himself says that God's people cry out day and night. This means that a long wait is now a reality. Therefore, the word quickly does not mean immediate gratification according to the human emotional rhythm. This means that when God's decisive justice arrives, it will not be too late in the ultimate sense. She will not miss her scheduled appointment. It will not be uncertain. It will not be biased. It will not be fragile. When God intervenes, he intervenes decisively. It will not need a checkup. You will not have to appeal. It will not need correction. This is important because many believers confuse delay with negligence. They assume that if God has not yet intervened, their cause may have been forgotten. Luke 18 says the opposite. The delay is a reality. The pain is real. Silence is a fact. But the message conveyed by this proverb is not one of negligence. The widow is asked to keep coming precisely because her perseverance will not be in vain. The disciples are asked to continue praying specifically because heaven has not lost the file. This is one of the most profound lessons of the Christian life. Delaying the decision is not the same as giving up. Silence is not the same as absence. Waiting is not the same as divine indifference. The reason believers know this is not because circumstances always improve quickly, but because God's attributes are different from the attributes of a judge. That's why variation is so important. If God were like a judge, delay would be a terrible thing. But since God is not like a judge, the delay becomes a context for continued faith rather than a test of God's coldness. It's a very harsh truth, but also a very necessary one. The Christian life is not lived through direct observation. One lives trusting in the good qualities of God. Luke 18 teaches us that trust is not a theory, but a practice. How does trust manifest itself in practice? It seems he will return. It sounds like another sentence. It's like reopening the wound before God. It seems that once again he has placed an unresolved burden before himself. It's like saying, Lord, I still believe that you judge fairly, even though I haven't seen the judgment yet. This is what the widow taught us. It teaches us that weakness and faith are not opposites. In fact, one of the hidden and fascinating aspects of this parable is that Jesus chooses the weakest character in the story to illustrate the greatest kind of resilience. A widow is not attractive. She is not victorious in the worldly sense. She doesn't control the place. She simply refuses to leave. In the kingdom of God, this rejection is important because faith doesn't always manifest itself in the noisy way people expect. Sometimes faith is silent. Sometimes faith runs out. Sometimes faith sounds more like a whisper than a shout. Sometimes faith means enduring another night without giving in to bitterness. Sometimes faith means praying with trembling hands. Sometimes faith doesn't involve a spectacular breakthrough, no visible sign, no emotional euphoria, and yet you say, Lord, I offer this to you once more. This is not a weakness of faith. This is unwavering faith. For this reason, this proverb has great pastoral power. It offers a language to believers who feel ineffective. It restores dignity to believers who feel overwhelmed. It gives a spiritual meaning to the act of continuing to pray when you say that all your feelings cease. The widow does not possess power as defined by the world, but he has access. Access to a judge is more important than apparent power when the judge has the ability to decide the case. In the Christian life, this is everything. Believers may appear weak throughout history. Believers may seem insignificant in the eyes of the world. Believers may lack worldly control mechanisms, but they have a way to reach God. Thanks to their access, they are never powerless in the deepest sense. This does not mean that they control the results. This means they can take their case to the higher court. This means they can scream day and night. This means that they cannot appeal to human compassion, but to divine justice. When you understand this, prayer becomes more than just a spiritual practice. Prayer becomes a means to access the covenant. Prayer becomes a sacred urgency. Prayer becomes a rejection of interpreting history solely through what the eyes see. The prayer says, this world does not explain itself. Evil is not final. Delay is not the end. There is a judge. This changes the emotional climate of the entire Christian life. Because if there is a judge, then silence is not the same as a lack of meaning. If there is a judge, then suffering is not proof that evil has truly triumphed. If there is a judge, then injustice can be considered honest without needing to venerate it as an absolute truth. If there is a judge, believers can wait without abandoning the moral structure of the universe. This is one of the reasons why Luke 18 is so important today. Modern people live in a world saturated with delays, anger, power imbalances, legal failures, institutional apathy, and burnout. People know what it feels like to be confronted by systems that don't care. People know what it feels like to see the truth slowly advance while corruption spreads rapidly. People know what it feels like when they are asked to continue trusting while circumstances remain unresolved. Luke 18 does not deny any of that. All of this places it within a deeper horizon. The Bible says that there is a judge above all judges. There is a court that is superior to all other courts. There is a justice that goes beyond human judgment. There is a form of faith that endures precisely by continuing to shout with that confidence. For this reason, this text should not be reduced to pray more. This should be understood as pray as people who know that the Supreme Court is not corrupt would. This is different, completely different. One of them is a religious symbol, the other is a worldview. One of them is a style, the other is trust in the pact. Once you understand that, the proverb takes on a completely new meaning. The widow is not just a symbol of resilience. It is a symbol of sincere protest. She is a witness against the resignation. It is a living refutation of silent despair. His repeated appearances before the judge meant, in effect, this error remains important. This case is still ongoing. This injustice is not normal. I will not consider it closed until the truth has been revealed. Spiritually, this is what prayer does. The prayer rejects premature closure. Prayer refuses to make evil acceptable. Prayer refuses to allow the darkness of reality to be defined without questioning it. Prayer preserves what has not been resolved before the one who sees clearly. For this reason, the sentence is not passive. Prayer is one of the things believers do most often. She is an ethically active person. She is spiritually active. She is actively involved in matters related to life after death. It extends into God's future and evokes the promise of justice in the language of the present. He says, "Because you are righteous, I will not stop asking for justice." Yes, prayer can include personal needs, personal sorrows, daily sustenance, guidance, healing, and mercy. But Luke 18 reminds us that prayer also includes longing for God's justice. This includes calling for the world to be fixed. This includes the desire for the definitive eradication of evil. This includes a deep longing for the arrival of the kingdom in its entirety. For this reason, Jesus does not conclude his discourse with practical advice, but with a question for investigation. Will the Son of Man find faith? Will he find people who still believe that justice belongs only to God? Will you find people who haven't fully adapted to the collapse of this era to the point that they no longer cry out? Will God find people who still pray with moral urgency? Will he find people who still yearn for that land? Will he find people who are still waiting without having sold their soul to pessimism? This is the question that resonates in the proverb. This is the question that looms over every generation of the church. Can faith withstand comfort? Can faith withstand the delay? Can faith withstand institutional failure? Can faith withstand cultural pressures? Can faith withstand the usual long period in which drastic answers don't always come quickly? Jesus poses the question because he knows that the answer cannot be taken for granted. Faith must be preserved. Hope must be protected. Prayer should be practiced, not as an empty routine, but as a living attraction. So, what effect should this passage have on us? First, this should deepen our understanding of prayer. Prayer is not a simple religious practice. Prayer is the cry of the people of the covenant to the righteous judge. Secondly, this should transform our understanding of vulnerability. Weakness does not negate faith. In this parable, weakness becomes the setting where faith is most clearly manifested. Third, this should purify our understanding of God. God does not weaken before his servants. His shouting doesn't bother him. He has no moral qualms when it comes to justice. He is different from the judge, and he is not a saintly version of him. Pacificist theology of work. Fourth, it should reveal the true danger of delay. The danger of delay is not limited to pain alone. The danger lies in the loss of the heart. The danger lies in the slow erosion of expectations. The danger lies in becoming the type of person who no longer asks sincere questions. Therefore, Jesus says, pray and do not despair. He doesn't just offer advice, protect the soul. Fifth, this passage should remind us of holy obstinacy. Stubbornness is not accompanied by pride. It is not stubbornness that demands control, but the stubbornness that refuses to renounce God's justice. The widow continues to attend because she still believes the cause is important. Believers continue to pray because they still believe the cause is important. Your suffering matters. Your unanswered concern is important. The injustice that saddens you is important. The evil you see in the world is important. It's important to long for the coast. Longing for the return of Christ is important. Everything is important. Because it is important, the prayer must continue. So, if you're going through a period where you feel your prayers are repetitive, listen to Luke 18 again. If you get tired of asking, listen to Luke 18 again. If you have any unfinished business, listen to Luke 18 again. If you are inclined not towards rebellion, but towards quiet inner surrender, listen again to Luke 18. The widow keeps coming. Jesus says that this is the form of faith. It's not ostentatious. He is not always emotionally strong. It's not always impressive. But they are sincere. Tried. Return. Attractive. Permanent. One day the wait will end. The Son of Man will come one day. The day will come when justice will be done without delay. The day will come when all unjust judgments will be overturned. A day will come when everything hidden will be revealed. The day will come when every opponent will have to answer to the true judge. One day the tension between promise and execution will finally be revealed. On that day, the question will no longer be whether justice matters or not. The question that will be posed is, has faith endured? Shall we continue praying, regardless of whether we continue with the lawsuit or not? Do we still believe that God is just when the world seemed corrupt? Because one day the court will close its doors and there will be no more appeals. So continue to present your case to God as long as mercy calls you to Him. Don't lose hope. Don't confuse silence with absence. Don't confuse delay with negligence. Don't let pessimism control your spirit. He prays. To scream. Wait with faith. Keep the case open before God. Because this example is not small. It's a courtroom. Each believer must decide whether to continue attending.